are in the UN Decade of Action for Nutrition, and we are seeing an increased momentum to inform action in terms of leveraging agriculture food systems for nutrition and health outcomes. So in that quest, in the last, say, 7 to 8 years, there have been 3 key developments. The first one is really about laying out the conceptual pathways between agriculture and nutrition, and then developing frameworks or empirical theoretical frameworks to aid our empirical inquiry into these linkages. Several of you have been a part of such an endeavor from your own institutions or various collaborations. This has led to a momentum in evidence generation. The first tranche of research work since the 11-12 to 2014 has been really about understanding the linkages between agriculture and nutrition and health outcomes. Really looking at the correlations between various aspects of these production and marketing systems to nutrition outcomes, and then testing the impacts of various programs and policies. Thankfully, what all these show is that actually agriculture and nutrition programs, the recent review by Ruel et al. From IFPRI, show that actually these programs have an impact on production, women's empowerment, and actually several of these pathways do pan out, even although Jeff said, yes, to Jeff Laurent, that even though we haven't seen the impacts on stunting for various reasons. A part of one of the exciting thing that has happened in the third stage of development is really about innovations. We are slowly moving away from just looking at homestead food production programs, although they are terribly important and they remain important. The gamut of the types of policies and programs that we are assessing and trying to understand have, for example, expanded quite substantially. Now, the complexity of our understanding and therefore the complexity of a research endeavor and research enterprise has also increased as we are embracing environmental fragility, urbanization, rural transformations, information technology, and how they play out in the evolution of our food systems and how they shape the risks, vulnerabilities, and opportunities for people's risk for health and nutrition outcomes or benefits. So naturally, when we are innovating and moving ahead, there has been a huge demand, articulated demand, for various methods, metrics, and tools to help us move this field forward. That's where Imana fits in. The aim of Imana is to accelerate the development of robust scientific evidence base needed to guide policy investments in agriculture for improved nutrition and health outcomes. We have 3 work streams under Imana Grants, which is led by LSHTM, which is London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as if you haven't had enough acronyms in the last 2 days. The main aim of Imana Grants is to accelerate the development of interdisciplinary methods, metrics, and tools. This is really a high-level scientific endeavor, and several of the grantees, if most of the grantees are in the room, and you will meet them in the methods, metrics fair. So we had 2 rounds of grants. That's what we have been funded for, and we have awarded all the 15 grants. And the second stream of work, which we are also very proud of, is Imana Fellowships, which, as I said, Will leads. The aim of this is to build a cadre of early career researchers or our future leaders in various aspects in agriculture and food systems, nutrition, and health. We were funded for 4 rounds, and these are 1-year fellowships, and we have awarded all the 4 rounds. And the third one is the reason you are here today, for the most part, is the ANH Academy, which is, as you all know by now, is a global research network facilitating and sharing of research and ideas in this context. So we have tried, of course, to map various grants that we have given, but I will, and it's surprisingly difficult to put even in one grant into just one particular box. But I thought what would be of interest to you all here is some of this, there are different ways in which we can cut the pie, and this is one way, is that we have a series of grants on intra-household resource allocation or women's empowerment related issues. We have innovative large-scale methodological experiments that people have conducted or research programs have conducted. Use of various modeling methods, for example, Bayesian methods and decision trees, to guide investments in nutrition-sensitive agriculture. Several of you have attended today the Learning Lab on Indicators for Affordability of Nutritious Diets, EANDA project, and that's really about capturing prices, for example, and there are several market-related metrics on prices, markets, and value chains. And also, several of our grantees are developing various ways of using ICTs. Yesterday, Giacomo and team have, for example, given a learning lab on use of accelerometers, and you have attended several others as well. So there are several ways. Wearable user cameras are one of the ways in which you could also capture women's workload. So these are the innovations that are now being undertaken, and these tools are currently developed and being tested under IMANA grants. Now, to IMANA fellowships briefly, we are very proud of the diversity that we managed to achieve in this somewhat what we thought was an abstract topic to begin with. But I think we all in this journey learned a lot together, and to also attract talent from various parts of the world. As you can see, we have a nice diversity of fellows in terms of sex, where they come from, where they want to go in their life with this fellowship, and what it would do to them, their motivations, so on and so forth. But if you map them, again, the topics, they also fall into various topics on animal source foods, farm household production, you see the policies, programs, so on and so forth. But one of the key things they go away with these fellowships is really research management, which we know is terribly important. Some of us learn way too late in our lives and struggle. So what we are trying, and Will and his team are trying with their host and home mentors, is really inculcating research management skills. These we expect and we think these fellows are gaining management skills by conceptualizing, designing, implementing, and closing out the projects in this 1 year. Finally, on the ANH Academy, one of the key things that we do is that I'll highlight now is the technical working groups. But in all these, the soul of really the Academy and IMANA is in really the capacity building among future research leaders. We put a lot of effort into it, and as you go through the next 4 days or 3 days, we'd really encourage you to talk to each other, encourage some researcher who is in the early career. They might be experienced in one topic, but may not be in another. Please do talk to them, early career researchers, and it means a lot to all of us in the room. So finally, on to the technical working groups. We have 5 technical working groups at various stages. 3 working groups have produced briefs. They will be available at the Methods and Metrics Fair. And several of the working group members are either here at the table or in the audience here. And we have somewhat of a quasi-working group on time use, which is on the use of time and how it's conceptualized and how it is measured. And we have started a working group on economic evaluation. Will, Carol Levine lead it, and Jan Lowe is a part of that. And Zach Gerstein leads a working group on animal source foods. This is innovative because we have tried to continue to engage IMANA fellows who have even finished to come together from their diverse perspectives and disciplines to this topic of animal source foods. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'm Deborah Johnston, and I'm part of the time use working group. And just to explain what that work has involved. So the work started in a systematic review of the links between agriculture and nutrition outcomes, but via time use. And this might sound like really standard stuff now, but back when we were doing it in 2014, 15, it was a really important time to reflect on on those approaches, we asked 3 important questions. Do women spend a great deal of their time in agriculture? Do women have time burdens and time constraints so that they have trade-offs? And do agricultural interventions increase women's time use so that they have to make trade-offs? And we got answers to those questions. I'm going to leave you with that hook, though, because in my next answer, in the next part of this, I will give you the answers. But what I wanted to say is the important thing that we did through that working group was we looked at time use surveys. How did they work? What was best practice? What was standard out there? And those are the things that I want to reflect on when I come back further on in this panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I am Zoter from Ethiopia. I am a Imana postdoctoral fellow. I'm working on impact of home gardening on breast milk vitamin A composition and child vitamin A intake. And this work was initiated because theoretically we know that agriculture has a potential to influence health and nutrition at large. However, there are uncertainties in how to fulfill the potential of this agriculture because the link between agriculture, nutrition, and health is complex. So a recent study indicated it's difficult to document the link between agriculture, nutrition, and health because the link is very complex. So the limitation that indicates the knowledge gap about the nutrition improvement through agriculture is not well documented. So we initiated this study with the aim of indicating or quantifying how agriculture can contribute to improve nutrition and health through using breast milk vitamin A as a matrix.
So my name is Sudha Narayanan. I'm working at the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research in Mumbai in India. I'm an agricultural economist by training, but I represent a team which is multidisciplinary. So I have Erin Lenz, who's here. She's a sociologist at the University of Texas in Austin. We have Mazia Fontana, a feminist economist based in the UK, who's part of the team, and Dr. Bharti Kulkarni, who's a nutritionist in the National Institute of Nutrition in India. Our work is titled Women's Empowerment in Nutrition Index. And at the time when we applied for the grant, we felt that empowerment, of course, is a very complex concept, and there are different dimensions in which women can be empowered, and at the same time, you can be disempowered on other dimensions. So we felt if we want to understand the links between women's empowerment and nutrition, we would have to conceptualize the notion of empowerment closer to the nutrition domain so that we can understand the links better. So our effort was essentially trying to conceptualize and measure nutritional empowerment. And the second motivation for us, and it was it's something that's been the heart of all our effort, is to actually put women at the center of our research. So a lot of existing research looks at the links between women's empowerment and child nutritional outcomes, and we wanted to look at the link between women's empowerment and nutrition, their own nutritional status in their own right. So these have been the motivations, and I'll share more of our experience shortly.
Good afternoon. My name is Jan Lowe. I'm with the International Potato Center, and I'm part of the Economic Evaluation Technical Working Group. And as was mentioned by Sunitha, this is led by Cara Levin of the University of Washington, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this year, but I think has participated in the last two. And of course, Will is a part of the team, so he can bail me out on anything I don't represent appropriately. This group, I think, came together. It consists of 11 people who I think have been working in the area of trying to integrate agriculture, nutrition, and health interventions. And the question that always comes up, when you're trying to do economic analysis is how should you go about it when you're cutting across a diverse multi-sectoral community? You have a lot of agricultural economists or economists that have been used to working in the agricultural sector, for example, that might feel more comfortable with cost-benefit analysis. You have the group coming over from health that's done a lot of cost-effectiveness work, or maybe use cost-utility models and dailies and whaleys. And we have to have these two groups talking to each other. And so the idea behind this group is really to look at the literature, review the literature, have guidelines that we can give out to people about how what we've learned from our individual experiences, what are the best references out there, and to give some guidelines on how we would recommend that you go about looking at costs and evaluating the multiple benefits that come out of an integrated intervention. And so I think we'll be building on that.
Good afternoon, I'm David Little from the University of Stirling in Scotland. And I'm part of a team that's in charge of developing a metric for aquaculture nutritional impact on girls in Bangladesh, a metric that we hope to validate in Cambodia. We're an interdisciplinary team. We're surrounded by nutritionists who tend to argue with each other about how to do nutrition. We have a health economist. We have very good local partners in Bangladesh. My colleague, Dr. Mamun's in the audience. And we're setting out to really make the links between how Bangladeshis source their aquatic food and their health, particularly with regard to this vulnerable group, adolescent women. Now, Bangladesh is a country where people like to eat fish. 3 times a day is not abnormal. And yet, there's considerable levels of nutritional deficiencies in the country. And we believe that aquatic animals are often not fully acknowledged in their roles in terms of making up that nutrition. I think there's other countries in the world where the same thing occurs. We're basically trying to make the link between how and where aquatic animals are being produced along a saline gradient in southwest Bangladesh, and then trying to link it to not just what the young adolescent women eat, but their nutritional outcomes as well. So we're trying to square that circle and come up with advice that both local public health practitioners can use, and indeed people trying to encourage farmers to change their agricultural practices. So that's our project, and it's great to be here. Thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Chris Kahns. I'm a current Imana postdoctoral fellow based out of Boston, Massachusetts. As a historian of environment and agriculture, not a scientist, I am perhaps an oddball amongst this group. Nutrition is admittedly a new topic for me. Yet, I have found that I'm interested in similar questions about health, nutrition, agriculture, and environment as most of the people in this room. And I do believe that history has much to say about these topics. In 2017, I completed a dissertation on the environmental history of Lesotho from about 1880 through 1965. The dissertation explores the broad shifts in knowledge, technology, and agriculture, as well as environmental and cultural change. Now, one of the things as I explored the possibility of becoming an Imana Fellow that turns up in the historical record is a deficiency disease called pellagra. Shows up across many different documents, and in researching it and explaining how in the 1930s and 60s there is really an exponential rise, speaks to questions about environmental and social justice, as well as ecological change, and of course, health and nutrition. This is the subject of my current Imana research. Imana offers an opportunity for me to do what I might call applied history. That is, doing research that puts me into conversation with scientists and with policymakers. I'm grateful to Imana for supporting this research, which enabled me to travel back to Lesotho, South Africa, and the UK for 4 months of research earlier this year, where I explored materials in archives as well as gathering oral histories and doing ethnographic research.
Thank you very much, Chris, and all of the panelists. As you can tell, the aim of Imana has really been to cast a very wide net with grants programs that bring in these senior leaders who brought a strong track record of research in one area to our domain, the emerging leaders from the Amana Fellows program, with this really wide range of disciplinary backgrounds. Chris Cons is actually our first historian to remind us that micronutrient deficiencies are actually an old thing, and that archival record actually releases a lot of rich data about the early identification in the 1930s, the agricultural change in the 1960s that informs actions today. And we want to keep this conversation zooming out. We'll soon switch to this very noisy method and metrics fair, which we hope will really be noisy as you interact with each of us and the many other fellows around. So as Sunita mentioned, there were 22 of the fellows. We had originally wanted the panel to include Aissatou Ouedraogo to represent the sort of Francophone West African component of our work. She works on agriculture in Burkina, and many others that you'll interact with. But we have these three questions to kind of move this conversation forward, to ask each of the panelists about their individual trajectory. How has the opportunity to join this conversation perhaps influenced their own thinking as a researcher, as a scientist, how they think the work that they've been able to do through Amana has contributed to their community, and what they feel the agenda going forward has to offer in terms of knowledge gaps and new applications of the tools that we're working with. And Deborah started the panel and started with this tantalizing teaser, I would say, for some possible directions that she's seen in her own work.
Thanks, Will. So as I said, we had three questions that our time use systematic review set out to answer. Do women spend a lot of time on agriculture? Well, our finding there was yes, they do. This is not so shocking, I think, to most of us, but it was important to have that time use data collected from low and middle income countries from across the world to help substantiate that. The second question was, do women have time burdens that lead to trade-offs? And I want to come back to that and to use that to answer the first question of Will's. The third thing that we wanted to look at was, do agricultural interventions increase time burdens? Now, this was really hard because there was such a limitation in terms of high quality data. But what we did find for those few studies of interventions was that where time use was recorded, agricultural interventions did increase time burdens. So we got answers to two of our questions. I want to come back to that one that I said I wasn't going to answer. Did those increased time burdens lead to a trade-off? And importantly, the thing we're all thinking about here, did an increase in the time burden because of an agricultural project mean that there was a trade-off for nutritional outcomes, so that women were less able to grow food, to prepare food, or to feed children, or to engage in other childcare? And we really found that that answer was complex. It wasn't true that in every case the answer was actually yes. We found that there were definitely cases where time burdens had risen, but there was even evidence of positive impacts on nutrition. And this brings me back to the issue of what the focus on methods and metrics has meant for my work. Because if we break that down to say, well, why did we find increased time burdens, but a mixed picture on nutritional outcomes? It was because of the complexity of time as a metric. And what I wanted to reflect on is the fact that when we look at methods and metrics, these are not neutral things. These are things that actually change our conceptualization, our analytical approaches. So in doing that work, I thought of the fact that time is a really complex metric. And we have to conceptualize what we mean by time burdens. What's a time burden? Where does something become a time constraint? So it was an amazingly enriching metric. It brought together areas of activity that are actually usually separate, so health outcomes and economic activity. The issue is, though, how do we conceive of our metrics? So every metric that we innovate, how does it fit into our conceptual framework? And so what I wanted to leave us with is the concept of time constraints poses a challenge for the discipline that I'm in, economics. And it means that we have to extend that discipline, but I know that that's one of Will's questions, so I will end it there.
As I have already said, our project is proposed to systematically study the impact of home gardening on breast milk vitamin A composition and child vitamin A intake. And through this, we wanted to indicate how agriculture, nutrition, and health is related. If we see breast milk composition and child vitamin A intake, it is an indicator for the nutritional status of the mother and the health of the child. So we believe that these two can be a matrix, and we can use different simple tools to measure the breast milk vitamin A and the child vitamin A intake through this project.
So my own experiences comes from my training in economics, and I just want to share what thinking about concepts, methods, and metrics did for me. I even as an economist, I cared deeply about methods and metrics. But the questions that I were asking was, how do economists measure it? What are the different ways in which they do it? But I think, specifically with the Imana grant and the fact that we have a multidisciplinary team, I think my horizons have broadened to ask, what is the best way to measure it? And transcending the disciplinary boundaries, what is the right way to do it? And is there a right way to do it? So I would say the disciplinary boundaries within which I was operating has changed considerably for me. And especially our interaction with the nutritionist has been especially rewarding intellectually, because she assumed that we knew how to do things right, and we assumed that she had the right answers to everything, and we realized we actually have to put it together and work harder. So I would say that's one thing. The second, my perspective has changed also because my training in economics came at a time when causal inference began to dominate most quantitative work. So establishing a causal relationship between two variables and thinking very carefully about identification strategies and techniques. And I think there's a fundamental question that's less carefully looked at, and that's about construct validity. So if you don't have your constructs and measures right, you could pretty much find impacts on anything, even if you get all your technical issues right. So for me, it became really important to think about construct validity before moving on to rigorous inferences in the causal framework.
In terms of what we hope will be the benefit of the community to the community, I would imagine it would be preventing you from having to go out and reinvent the wheel. I think some of the discussions we've been having, I wish I'd known all this before I would be designing a cost study, in my own work. And I think that's what we're hoping to achieve, is that there will be enough guidelines within this document, because one of the key things I think when you're looking and doing any kind of cost-benefit work is you really need to know what you want to collect at the beginning of your work. I'll just give one example here, and we have other examples that will be on the poster in the other room. But typically, when you think about costing out your intervention, you look at what the project is spending in different areas. And that's pretty complex in and of itself when you're doing an ag, nutrition, or a livelihoods project, because you want to have those costs. You have to divide up, well, what percentage of my staff time is going into agriculture, or what's going into facilitation, what's going into training. You have all those difficulties within the budget, and some budgets are more detailed than others, but you can capture that information to a certain extent. But then as we were thinking and reflecting with the group, you also have another set of costs that you often don't capture. And that's the cost that the household itself might be having to spend by participating in this new approach to dealing with growing a more nutritious crop or participating more in a health service activity. And then you would have the opportunity costs that might come to the households or to the health services for being part of that activity that you might not capture if you don't think about it ahead of time. And then you have to make those critical decisions on which ones can you afford to collect, which ones are the most influential, and really that whole decision of how do we set it up from the beginning so we don't get halfway through our intervention and then figure out, oh, we didn't collect this. So I think what we're hoping to do is prevent the reinvention of the wheel in terms of setting up and making your decisions on what is the best approach for you to look at the costs and benefits of integrated interventions.
I've been involved in quite a few multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary projects in my time, but I think some of them are quite disappointing, and I think it's because it's quite a hard thing to do. A lot of that is about speaking the same language or understanding each other's terms. And this is where I think having a metric at the heart of a project is proved for us to be a very, very useful feature. It's allowed us essentially to have to develop an understanding of each other's disciplines to the level that makes sense in a joined up and useful output for people who are going to use it. And that means that sometimes we need to understand each other's knowledges or explain them to each other. But it's become that focus that I think so often interdisciplinary projects that end up to be parallel lines of work rather than integrated towards a common purpose, they often suffer from. And I think this has been a great strength in focusing on a metric in terms of the project we're involved with.
So my comments, I think, kind of hit on maybe the three questions in some ways, especially the idea of gaps certainly struck me. I would say that most interventions that I've seen in my own field work and that I've read about have precedence. Some of them very like things that we see now being done in regards to agriculture and nutrition, some less alike. And that these precedents are very important to learn from. For example, in Lesotho, one of the central parts of their agricultural policy today, which is very much linked to nutrition, is this idea of conservation agriculture, no-till, digging small holes, conserving soil, moisture, and so forth. And to my knowledge, it's enjoyed very little success. And one of the things that I've seen in my work is that there are things we can point to in the past. For example, an intensive labor and knowledge system called Machibani farming, which enjoyed some success. But when we analyze this system, we can understand and see what sorts of knowledge was at play, where did it come from, who was involved in these initiatives, and of course, most importantly, what were the outcomes and why were those the outcomes? But of course, as a historian, we often get stuck in this idea. It's like, well, this happened earlier and we should all learn from it. But of course, as a metric or method, that's not enough to say that. Instead, I hope to say that not only was this already done, we need to suggest what did work, because often it is a small component of a particular initiative that worked in the past. Why did it work? Who did it work for? Who did it not work for? And what were the reasons for this? Okay? These things, I believe, can serve to inform a kind of current production, circulation, and application of various policies, and not least, the underlying knowledge that informs these policies.
That's very helpful, and I think it's quite remarkable. A couple of things, just want to pick up on a couple of points that were made. One is this idea of interdisciplinary opportunities to learn from each other and discover how little is actually known in that other discipline. So this idea of expecting nutritionists to know and then finding that there are some, and similarly oneself, is quite a dramatic aspect of this. The other is the degree to which a metric provides a common ground for people who speak different languages to say, oh, we're actually talking about the same thing, because now we've... And I'm curious if we could just turn to the last question, this question of gaps and opportunities, priorities. So as we mingle around the room and we look in this Method and Metrics Fair for potential partners, institutional partners, potential people in other regions with whom we could collaborate, and looking for ways to write proposals that will be compelling to actually be able to do the work that we hope to do. I'm wondering if each of you could turn to that and what you see as one or two really high impact opportunities that people could be sort of inspire and inform people as we turn to the Method and Metrics Fair after this.
As far as gaps, I guess I would beat the drum of having to, this idea of speaking across disciplines. And again, to reiterate, history not just as background to something. Well, we need to know what happened before and then we can actually move on to the real stuff. I would argue that history is actually an analog, whether it is recent history in the last 20 years or in the project that I'm doing, quite a bit older in the later colonial period. Again, I have found time and time again, I served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Lesotho many years ago, and seeing some of the things that agricultural volunteers were doing and talking about as if they were fresh, and then wondering why it was that people were disinterested in keyhole gardens or any of these other things that have a kind of deeper precedent. The tendency, I think, is to think of these interventions as apolitical, as if they don't matter for things like property regimes, who gets what share of proceeds from a particular project. And I think that by looking at these things in the past, we can learn from these analogs. And these things are there. They are in documents that are very, very accessible. And this is, I think, one of the things that I'd be happy to answer questions on when I do my poster or so forth. Where are these materials? How do we know about these things and these outcomes in the past?
Well, to build a little bit on that, I think one thing that our project's thrown up is the importance of not just interdisciplinarity, but also the intercultural aspect of these projects. That although you may go to two different countries where fish and other aquatic animals are absolutely basic foods, but people have very different views of them and how they're prepared and who catches them and even who eats them, when, and for what reasons. So that's been a valuable learning lesson. It wasn't, I think, perhaps something that we necessarily put very strongly in the proposal, but I think going forward, I wouldn't say it's a gap, because I think everyone who probably runs an Imana project is in that territory. It's interesting that at least 3 of us have worked in a developing country as a volunteer in our early years, which is a huge advantage, because when you do work at a common level with people that you're trying to work for, you learn so much more. And it's then, well, how do you apply it? And how can we somehow institutionalize those sort of processes into the research environment? Because many people who do research don't necessarily have that background. They come, if you like, through school. And yet the intercultural knowledges that underpin what we're doing, I think, are really important.
Yes, in terms of looking at the gaps in what we're trying to do and achieve, I think one of the great frustrations I think we all have that work in the integrated ag nutrition arena, when you say compare what we're trying to do in evaluation compared to, say, the introduction of a vaccine or the distribution of a supplement, is that we have a wide range of benefits, and benefits that are often difficult to put monetary values on. And that's the part of the equation I think that the group is still working on, is how do we come and be able to interpret with common metrics the vast benefits. But I think there's still a lot of interesting work to be done on how to set out from the beginning, how are you going to go about capturing your spillover effects, because they can be substantial in an ag nutrition intervention. I think it calls, a lot of what we're trying to do and achieve can be intergenerational over time. And particularly, looking at the benefits of interventions on behavioral change, or the gradual spread and adoption of new varieties or new technologies calls for a larger or a longer time frame and more longitudinal work than we're actually often being able to do in a proof of concept project. So I just put those out as two potential areas where I'd love to see more research, and of course, we need more resources for it.
I'd like to make one specific comment as an example from our own project and a few opportunities that we see collectively as emerging from the really expanded set of methods and metrics we have today. So in our own research, actually, we believe that we know so much more about, for example, intra-household allocation, which is closely related to women's empowerment. We know much more about it today, and we have more tools to look at it. And I think it's a great opportunity to revisit and reopen older debates. For example, in the 80s, intra-household allocation was often looked at from the perspective of intra-household distribution of expenditure or calories. But now in our own work, we found that health-seeking behavior was also differential between men and women. Women deprioritized their own health and often chose the cheapest type of treatment. And we find that a lot of these new insights can be used to revisit older debates. So I think that area is sort of open, and we see a lot of scope, and we've actually started working on some of these issues, that women, in fact, take a disproportionate burden of the shocks. Now, more generally, I think we see more methods and metrics today than in ANH than we did many years ago. And to me, there are 4 different opportunities that need to be tapped. And one of it speaks to cultural specificities and contextual differences. So I think even in our search to validate metrics across a wide range of contexts, I think it's also important to start commenting on and understanding whether different metrics fit the goal and the context of the situation. We may not accomplish finding this one right metric for all. So even though validation is important, I think to also understand appropriateness of different metrics to different goals or different contexts is important. The other thing is the use and abuse of metrics. I think unless those of us who research this also become advocates on the right way to use something, there's a danger that you just spawn a lot of literature, but it's not very clear what we learn from all of that. And I would say the third thing is actually, as coming as an economist, I'd like to see more research on the statistical and theoretical underpinnings of these new metrics to ensure that it supports judicious and correct use of these metrics.
What I see as a gap is there is little established methodology for designing agricultural programs and evaluating them for nutrition and health outcomes. If you take as an example my country, until recently, the national agricultural policies and interventions are not directed towards health and nutrition outcomes. The problem, one of the problems is inadequate scientific base to design effective policy and investment in agriculture so that it can work for improving nutrition and health situation. In addition, there is a scarcity of collaborative research involving nutrition, health, and agriculture experts, even though they are working for the same purpose. I think the concept of Imana will improve the situation in the future.
Thank you. So I think from the work that we did, there were 3 important gaps. And the first one is the fact that there's an important opportunity for agricultural interventions to actually use time use data. And that was that's important because in our work, we showed how time use data did help disciplines and sectors talk to each other, but importantly uncovered the issue of the pathway from agriculture to health in a way that other approaches couldn't quite do. So the first gap is to actually use time use data. The second gap is if you do use it and collect it, to do it in a way which is best practice. And there's, again, it's the issue of disciplines talking to each other. There is a huge range of researchers, particularly under feminist economics, who are collecting time use data, and they've set out some very clear guidance for best practice, and that best practice transfers over very strongly to this area. So if you come to us during the metrics fair, we can talk about that more. So the third gap I wanted to talk about is the gap around the richness of the data that we collect. And that's about the need to have both quantitative and qualitative approaches to understanding time use. And I think I can link back to what others have said, that it's through that mixture of quantitative and qualitative that one can really understand how relevant the metric is. And I started at the beginnings to say how important it is to understand time constraints and time trade-offs. To do that, one needs that contextual information. So 3 gaps: to use time use data, to actually collect time use data in a best practice way, and thirdly, to complement quantitative and qualitative work. Thank you.
I want to just ask the panelists for, outside their own deep dive area of work that you've talked about, whether there are things you're curious about from other areas that have really surprised you, right? So Jan, what do you think about time use? Zoeter, what do you think about history and so forth? Are there things that have caught your eye that you might want to follow up in this Methods and Metrics Fair as you approach others and ask them about their work?
I'd love to learn more about good data collection practice and analysis in time use, because I remember collecting the hell of a lot of time use data I never got to because the data set was so enormous and complicated. So it's an embarrassment for my past. So I think it is. Is it important enough? I think in all these things you say, you have so many areas to look at. Can we get by with using a qualitative technique for assessing the barriers to time use, or do we really need the quantitative data? That would be a question in my mind. Because it is important, but when you have so much other data to collect on nutrition outcomes, agriculture, productivity, etc., this is the problem we face, because these integrated systems, there are so many influential factors. What is the most cost-effective way to decide which data do you really collect? And I think the metrics are getting better, so probably it's much easier to do now than it was 10 years ago when I collected the other.
Well, on time use, actually, we are wondering how to even go about collecting it, since it seems so complex. I'll leave time use aside, but I think there's a lot of interesting work on using modern technological tools to collect data. And for me, that's really interesting in the sense that in the context of India, policymakers usually call you and say, can you write a note for us on what we should do about this? And some of them are very enthusiastic about it, so you need to be careful what you wish for, because you may get it. And we often don't have much response time. Projects are given 6 months. So I'm always searching, all of us are searching for ways in which we can bring down both the costs and the time, and actually also collect metrics that we all know through qualitative work is important, but unless you can quantify them, it's hard to make a case to policymakers. So I'm quite interested in all the technological approaches to collecting new and informative data.
Yeah, I'm pretty psyched about this idea of where fish fits in to affordable diets, particularly after this afternoon's workshop. Fish are always left out. That's what I feel. We're always left off the food discussions, and I think this is a great opportunity to bring them full square into these food systems research for all of their diversity and all the various values. They're just lumped in with high protein or animal source food. They're more than that. There are a whole bunch of attributes that really make them a superfood. And the thing is that they're significantly different because, for example, in our study in Bangladesh, people regularly eat 50 different species. 50 different species, not even all vertebrates. Finfish, shellfish, plants, mollusks. All of these things bring different things to the diets. We've got a lot of work to do.
I look forward to talking to everybody about from fish to potatoes, because to some extent, it is your predecessors, nutritional scientists, and people in your shoes now from the past whose reports form the basis of my work. So I want to learn more about how scientists think as well.
Thank you so much. This has been a great panel, and we proceed to this fair. Thank you.